to give testimony to the a congressional committee back in May that was examining the course of Russian-American relations. And the administration sent over its top person, a man named Dan Fried, who's the person who's in charge of Russian policy, to give the administration's point of view. And they invited one or two others of us to come and give a different point of view. And I was one of the people invited to do that. And so what I want to do is to kind of, and that's where the title of this lecture comes from, by the way, it's not mine. Russia Today in Transition, or Intransigent, was the title of this hearing that was organized. What I plan to do tonight is to kind of go over some of the ideas in that testimony that I gave, and to give you basically an expanded and updated version of the oral testimony that I gave, and then to take your questions. What I tried to do in the testimony was to raise and offer my answers, or tentative answers at least, to three questions that I hoped would be helpful to the committee in trying to determine whether Russia had become, was in transition or simply intransigent. The focus of this presentation, therefore, is on Russian foreign policy and the implications of Russian foreign policy for relations with the United States. However, I will be glad to answer questions you might have about domestic political developments in Russia during the question and answer session. There's a lot going on. I was actually returned from Russia about 3 weeks ago, during which time the president made some significant political changes in Russia, and there is a parliamentary election coming up in December of this year, and a presidential election coming up in Russia in March of next year. So there are a lot of kind of interesting things on the domestic political scene in Russia today. So if you want to know something about those, I'd be glad to, share my thoughts with you. But as far as tonight's session, the three questions I want to kind of raise and try to answer with you are, first of all, why should we care about Russia? Secondly, what are the underlying dynamics of Russian-American relations today? And thirdly, why have these relations deteriorated to the point that the United States Secretary of State, Secretary Rice, has had to travel to Russia to deny that there is a new Cold War between our countries, something she did in May of this year and again in October, more recently. So first and foremost, the first question to be addressed, why should we care about what happens in Russia? Why should we care about Russia at all? The question comes from a briefing that I received along with my mini-master students back in the beginning of the Bush administration, back in 2000 or 2001. We visited the executive office building of the White House and had a briefing from a National Security Council staff member. And at the end of it, I asked him how the NSC viewed Russia. And the answer back then was that Russia really didn't matter much anymore. It lacked the military or economic capacity that the Soviet Union had to project itself into world affairs, and that it could be largely ignored. At most, it might be occasionally a nuisance. This view of Russia is no longer valid in 2007. Whether we like it or not, Russia has again become a player in international relations, and especially a player in the Eurasian continent, where it is Putin's goal to make Russia the premier regional superpower. There are many reasons why we can't ignore Russia today, why we should care about what Russia does. Let me itemize just a few. First of all, Russia can hurt us. They really do have, unlike Iraq, they really do have weapons of mass destruction. And more than any other country, and second to nobody, including ourselves. The Soviet Union, or rather Russia today, remains, like the Soviet Union, the only country in the world that could absorb a first strike attack from the United States and inflict unacceptable retaliatory damage, something called mutual assured destruction, which is the cornerstone of nuclear strategic relations between our countries and has been from the Soviet period to today. Virtually, it's scary, but if Russia, like the Soviet Union, decided to launch a nuclear attack, it would happen in 30 minutes or so, probably before I finish this lecture. And that is frightening. What theoretically deters them from doing that is the threat of massive retaliation. They also have more recently something that you may or may not have heard of. Anybody here know what Moab is? No? Yeah?
It's the mother of all bombs.
Yeah, good.
Oh.
Mother of all bombs. I don't know if you, yeah.
Isn't that what America has? Don't they have the father of all bombs?
Yeah, that's right. Recently, over the summer, they tested the father of all bombs, which is a nanotechnology device that evaporates all living beings within its radius. So, I mean, we're moving to new and better forms of human destruction. So they do really have, they can hurt us. Secondly, they have vast energy resources. They've supplanted Saudi Arabia now as the largest single producer of oil in the world. 40% of the gas energy supplies that Europe receives come from Russia. These economic strengths are likely to increase over time, not the other way around. Thirdly, they are of strategic importance almost everywhere in the world that matters to us, to the United States. This includes, among the list, Korea, where Russia was part of a 6-country team trying to resolve the issue of North Korea's nuclear explosions, nuclear bomb. They are important to us in Israel and in the Arab-Israeli crisis as a member of the so-called quartet of powers pursuing the roadmap to peace. They are an important part of the non-proliferation process, and in that regard are a key to resolving our current standoff with Iran over the issue of nuclear weapons. They have continued their support in another area of the world, in Afghanistan. They have continued their support in the war against the Taliban. They are a vital participant with the so-called STANs, the 5 Central Asian countries and China, in something called the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. They are a member of, and recently the president of, the G8, and so of obvious importance to Europe. And they are important to us in many other areas of the world. What Russia does or doesn't do, in short, matters in all of these strategically important areas of the world. Fourthly, they hold why we should care about Russia. Fourthly, they hold a veto in the Security Council, which gives them the ability to thwart measures that might be in our interest but are not necessarily in their interest. This has become very apparent recently in Russia's response to the UN Security Council proposal to make the province of Kosovo independent. Russia has threatened to veto this process. Russia's participation is also going to be important in transnational issues for the foreseeable future. Issues like AIDS, issues like global warming, environmental protection, are simply issues that are not going to be resolved without Russia's participation. In short, like it or not, Russia has reemerged under Putin's leadership as a force to be reckoned with in international relations. The second question I want to raise and begin to answer with you is what are the underlying dynamics of Russo-American relations today? History, I think, has shown that Russian and American relations have alternated between periods of cooperation and confrontation. And my view is that whether relations have been more competitive or more confrontative or cooperative have depended upon the degree to which the leaders of both countries perceive that they have common interests. If I go briefly, kind of broad overview historically, the first period of Russian-American relations starting when the Soviet Union came into being in 1917, the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, till about 1933 was a period of considerable hostility in Russian-American relations. The United States joined with the countries of Europe in imposing a diplomatic isolation on Russia, and indeed the United States refuses to recognize the Bolsheviks as the legitimate government of Russia until 1933. The hostility in this period gives way to cooperation, again, in the face of common interests. In this particular case, it was to come together in the face of emergent fascism on the European continent. And from 1933 to 1945, you have a period of cooperative efforts between the two countries, culminating in the alliance, of course, against fascism in World War II. The post-World War II period again returns to a period of extreme hostility and competition that's known as the Cold War. American perceptions were that Russia was seeking to expand and promote communism everywhere in the globe, but particularly in Europe. And it was in this period that we adopted the policy of containment, which was designed to prevent the expansion physically by treaties around the world. The period of the Cold War gives way again in the late 60s to growing cooperation between the United States and Russia. The principal reason for that cooperation, again relying on this idea that the leaders had perceived common interests, was that both sides came to the conclusion that they had little to gain by trying to win an arms race, but rather the mutual interest in trying to manage it. And out of this comes a period that's known as détente, the pinnacle of which, or the height of which, was reached probably with the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreements 1 and 2 and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Agreement of 1972. The period of détente was also characterized by coming to agreement over division of Europe, and you had the signing of the Helsinki Agreement in 1975. So this is a period of cooperation, détente as it was called. That period of cooperation yet again gives way to confrontation and hostility, particularly during the Reagan years, but even before the Reagan years. The Carter administration, the Democratic administration, focused on civil rights issues, and the unwillingness of the Soviet Union to allow Jews to emigrate freely became an ideological point of contention. This confrontation ratcheted up in the early 1980s with rhetoric from the Reagan administration about the evil empire that the Soviet Union was supposed to be. Reagan backed up that rhetoric by introducing new generations of intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe, and of course introduced something called Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. By 1985 or thereabouts, all negotiations between Russia and the United States had stopped. We had really come to a new impasse, a new Cold War, and no initiatives were forthcoming. From 1985 to 1985 to 1990, we see a whole new shift again in Russian-American relations with the coming of Gorbachev to power, the adoption of policies of perestroika. Gorbachev and Reagan find common ground on a variety of issues. First and foremost on the reduction of nuclear weapons, the so-called START process. They found common agreement in limiting and reducing conventional weapons and signed an agreement called the Conventional Forces in Europe Agreement in 1990. You have the end of the division of Europe into two parts, East and West, communist and democratic, however you want to put it, in this period of time. In short, by the time Gorbachev had left power, the two countries had found sufficient common language and common interests so that virtually all the issues that divided the two countries were by and large resolved by the time the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev leaves office at the end of 1991. What follows during the Yeltsin years is is interesting and a bit schizophrenic. The first few years were marked by a continuation of the kind of cooperation, the pro-Western orientation to Russian foreign policy that was characteristic of the Gorbachev years. But it gave way increasingly to growing concern on the part of the Russian leadership, the Russian public opinion, Russian academic leaders and the like, that the end of the Cold War might have been really good for the United States and for the West, but it hadn't delivered the kinds of promises and expectations to the Russians. And the Russians began asking whether or not what the United States was doing in foreign policy was in Russia's best interests. It might be in the Americans' best interest, but is it in our best interest? And the answer increasingly became, you know, really, we have some doubts about it. The United States began to raise issues about the Russian involvement in Chechnya. By the mid-1990s, it was clear that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was going to end eastward to include Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. NATO was indicated its willingness to use military force to resolve issues in Russia's backyard, specifically in Serbia and Bosnia in 1994, and in Serbia over Kosovo in 1999. Although START II, the agreement which was supposed to reduce nuclear warheads from 6,000 to 3,000 was ratified in the United States by 1995, but the Russian Duma refused to do it, citing these various activities on the part of the United States. And what really got them excited, unhappy, and angry with the United States was the discussion about doing away with the ballistic missile defense, the ABM Treaty of 1972, and creating a new ballistic missile defense system. So all of these come together, and I think ought to illustrate my main theme, which is that whether Russian-American relations have been cooperative or confrontative has depended on the perception of common interests. If you followed along with me far enough on that thesis, you can see why a similar situation would seem to be at work today. Today, the United States and Russia once again have a compelling common interest, arguably, this time in confronting Islamic terrorism that threatens the security of both sides. And indeed, initially at least, that kind of cooperation seemed to be forthcoming. The general indifference of the Bush administration in its early years, the first 6 months or so, came to be changed even before September 11th, when when Putin and Bush meet for the first summit in the summer of 2001 and seem to begin a genuinely warm relationship. It's at this time that President Bush made the remarkable observation and came to the remarkable conclusion that I looked at the man in his eyes. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. Think of that, Father Loya. After the September 11th attack on the World Trade Council, Putin becomes the first world leader to call the United States, to Bush to express sympathy of the American people. On a more practical level, within a week, he developed a concrete 5-point plan to assist in the fighting against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Russia would share intelligence with the United States, of which it had a considerable amount because of its own involvement there. It allowed the United States to use Russian airspace. It provided military assistance directly to the Northern Alliance that was fighting the Taliban, along with us. It made available its bases in Central Asia, and it even volunteered to fly missions to save American soldiers if that was necessary. In short, following the 9/11, Russia clearly had become an important ally of the United States in the war on terror. The recognition of this new mutual interest, this new relationship could be seen in other ways too. The United States began to drop its criticism of Russia over the involvement in Chechnya. Bush promised to get the Congress to repeal the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, an economic relic of the war, something that he has so far incidentally been unable to do. The growing personal as well as political relationship between the two leaders was apparent in the summit of November 2001 in Texas, in which the two leaders agreed in principle on the reduction of nuclear warheads to between 1,700 and 2,100 warheads each. Bush wanted to do this over a handshake behind the chuck wagon where they were enjoying beef, presumably. Putin was a little bit more prudent and wanted to have something in writing, and that was forthcoming in May of 2002 with the Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty. So all of this is evidence of American and Russian leadership recognizing they have common interests, a common threat that they should deal with, and evidence to support the sense that they could engage in cooperative activities together. Despite the continued existence of the common threat represented by Islamic terrorism, the close cooperation between Russia and the United States that was visible in 2001 and 2002 has given way to tension and competition by this year, by 2007. So the third question I want to raise and try to answer is what happened and what are the implications for American policy? Why has the relationship deteriorated? What I want to do is to do what I do, and as a few of you know, and who've had me in my courses on foreign policy, as dealing with Russia, is to invite you to try to think like a Russian, and to get onto the walls of the Kremlin and to look around you at the other areas of the world, but in this case particularly to look westward. From the Russian point of view, if you do this, I think from the point of view you'll see that the benefits of cooperation with the United States became increasingly uncertain over the past 5 years because of other policies pursued by the Bush administration. Among these was the withdrawal of the United States finally from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in May of 2002. That action, incidentally, invalidated the START II agreement, which I mentioned very briefly, which called for a reduction from 6,000 to 3,000 warheads on both sides and a subcategory of 1,600 delivery vehicles. One of the first things Putin had done when he came to office was something that Yeltsin was unable to do, and that was to get the Duma to ratify the START II agreement, very important nuclear agreement between the two countries. But the Duma did so contingent on the United States remaining within the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the 1972 ABM Treaty. When the United States abrogated that treaty, it also at the same time, the Russians abrogated START II. The second issue, which if you're looking over the walls westward from the Kremlin, that you see happening is the further expansion eastward of NATO. I mentioned the expansion of Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary in 1997. In 2002, there was a big bang further of some 7 former Soviet allies, including 3 countries that had been republics within the USSR, notably the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so in expanding eastward in this way, for the first time, you had NATO members directly on Russia's borders. This is NATO, incidentally, which in the Russian view had used military force against a civilian capital in Europe, namely in Serbia, when it bombed Belgrade. What really alarms Russia about the expansion eastward towards its borders, what really is the next domino on the table for them is the possibility that NATO, that Ukraine might gain NATO accession. A third issue, if you're looking at it over the walls of the Kremlin from the Russian point of view, was the expansion eastward of the European Union. Again, some 8 former communist countries, including the 3 Baltic republics, former republics of the Soviet Union, are all invited to and have become members of the European Union, but not Russia. So if you look over the Kremlin walls, what do you see? You see a redivided Europe. Only a redivided Europe whose boundaries have been moved further to the east. The most cooperation, the growing cooperation between Russia and the United States in the face of this common threat was Russia's unwillingness to back the United States in its war against Iraq. In March 2003, Putin said Russia would join France and China in casting a veto against any American resolution to use force against Saddam Hussein to make him comply with UN sanctions. But what really seems to have, prompted Russian concern was that the Iraq invasion represented, from their point of view, the first major application of the Bush Doctrine to the conduct of American foreign policy. From the Russian point of view, the departure from the policies of containment accepted by a succession of American presidents implied that the United States had abrogated to itself the right of preemption. That is, we would do what we wanted to do, when and where we wanted to do it, and how we wanted to do it. And we would do it unilaterally if necessary to ensure American interests abroad. For many countries, including Russia, this sounded like the assertion of the right to global hegemony. And in an angry speech in February of this year in Europe, Putin made his frustration with American policy abundantly clear. Let me read it to you because I think it'll give you the flavor of how far things had come from 2002 to 2007 and how far things had deteriorated. He said, "Everything that is going on in the world today is the consequence of attempts to implement a unipolar concept of the world. And what is the result? Unilateral, often illegitimate actions have not resolved any. On the contrary, they have caused new human tragedies and more tension." And went on to mention the United States directly. He says, "Some norms, in fact almost the entire legal system of one country, primarily the United States, have crossed their national borders and are being imposed on other countries in all areas, economic, political, humanitarian. Who is going to like that?" he asked rhetorically. This is a remarkable speech. It sort of marked a real bookend in the relationship between Bush and Putin, going from the warm and fuzzy to the cold and hard. By taking the side of those who opposed American action in Iraq, Putin seriously risked rupturing the new cooperative relationship between Russia and it did not happen overnight. Bush and Putin kissed and made up for a bit in 2003 at the 300th anniversary of St. Petersburg. But events since then have accelerated the discontent that has grown between the two countries. Among these activities, growing Russian-American friction over Russia's assistance to Iran in developing a nuclear energy plant. A second issue is this American decision to work with Poland to build a missile defense shield in Poland and an early warning radar system in the Czech Republic. From the Russian point of view, this is incomprehensible. The United States is putting weapons in Russia's backyard for a threat that simply does not exist at this point in time. A third issue is I mentioned before, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. Russia this summer suspended its ratification of that agreement in the face of the West's continuing insistence that Russia get Russian troops out of Georgia and Moldova. Yet another issue is this issue of Kosovo. The United States, France, Britain, and Germany are pushing for a Security Council resolution that would give Serbia's Kosovo province independence. Serbia is an old ally of Russia's. It is a Slavic Orthodox country, and in many ways, Russia regards Serbia as a friend and part of its backyard, and they will veto that action. When you add to all this list, this short list that I've just given you, Russia, the Bush administration's persistent and very public criticism of democracy, notably at their summit meeting in February 2005, because somehow Russia's democracy fails to meet American standards for what it should be. Putin's harsh speech that I just quoted from on February of this year becomes more understandable. So incidentally does his sarcastic response to proposals regarding missile defense which were made by Secretary of State Rice and Secretary of Defense Gates in October last month when they met at the high-level meeting at the president's country estate outside of Moscow. He said, we may someday decide to put a missile defense system on the moon. But before we get to that, we may lose a chance for agreement because of you people implementing your own plans unilaterally. So let me conclude, and then we can take some questions if you want. Where do we go from here? Despite continuing differences over specific issues, the fact is that today, as in the past, Russian-American relations depend on the perception of common interests. And for now, it seems to me that there remains a compelling common interest for both sides to cooperate, but this will not be achieved easily if the United States continues to insist on going it alone. The coming year may offer the opportunity for a fresh start. There will be new presidents in both countries in 2008. And from the Russian point of view, it really doesn't matter, and I'm really going to come across as partisan here, it really doesn't matter whether the American president is a Democrat or a Republican, but rather on whether the new president continues to insist on pursuing a unilateral foreign policy. So with that, I think I've used my 30 minutes of grace up, and I'll be glad to try to answer that you may have. Thank you. Thank you for that too. Who's first? Yes, sir.
I had a question. Isn't the common interest greatly threatened now because Russia's economy is greatly based on oil, and America's involvement in the Middle East has driven up the price of oil, so isn't it in their interest to keep prices high?
Part of the answer is, yeah, sure, Russia is awash in petrodollars and in gas and other energy commodities. And not only in those commodities, diamonds, gold, timber, nickel, and again, I come back to gas is almost as important as oil. But to assume that Russia's economy is solely based on the exploitation of natural resources, I think is a mistake. The Russian economy is not like other third world countries in that kind of dependency. Russia also has human resources, a very well educated population. They're doing a lot of interesting and innovative things with computers, with the design of medical equipment, even in areas of transportation. There's an awful lot of diversification going on of the Russian economy that we're only beginning to hear about. If you had come with me to Moscow and even Yaroslavl, the provincial capital, a few weeks ago, I think you would have been astounded at how fast and rapidly things are growing over there, and how expensive things have become. Moscow has become the most expensive city in the world. It's part of this is foreign investment into a country that has human resources, an educated, skilled workforce that actually works hard. And if you want, there was this article in the, I grabbed it today, somebody sent it to me, you might enjoy reading it. It's from the Financial Times. It's a section called Investing in Russia, Too Good to Resist. There are a lot of companies. If you want to find out what the list of them are, then you might want to take a look at this. It was accidental that I grabbed it, but I think it'd give you a picture of the diversity of the Russian economy. As to the impact of Russia's control over these energy resources, it greatly enhances Russia's ability to project its influence, its power, especially in the Eurasian part of the world where Putin wants to establish Russia as a regional superpower. In particular, it already has that relationship with Europe, where Europe is dependent upon Russia's resources, and Russia has shown itself, for better or worse, to be not unwilling to use that leverage for political reasons, in the case of Ukraine, in the case of Belarus. But it also has growing economic ties with China and with Japan, which will enable it to, there are some pipelines that are being built that will transfer a lot of this gas and oil energy to the Far East as well. So I think for the foreseeable future, you're going to see Russia's economy grow here for the past 7 years or so, and I think you're going to see that one of the things Putin has done is to use that excess foreign currency to build up what am I looking for? Savings that is being used to diversify the economy further. So it's a long, rambling answer to your very good question. Who else would like to ask one? Yes, sir.
Could you maybe talk about the implications of some of Russia's sharing of military technologies with countries that aren't necessarily that friendly with us? I know specifically I've heard some rather unsettling information about, like missile technology sharing with countries like China. If you could talk about that.
Right. It's not really my area of specific research interest, so I don't spend an awful lot of time, and so I don't know really all the technical details of it. But in broad brushstrokes, you're absolutely right, and it goes to your question too, which was, are they totally dependent upon natural resources and oil? One of the other things in which the Soviet Union was a first world producer was military weapons, and it continues to be. And you're right to pinpoint China as probably one of the single most largest consumers of that weaponry, some of it quite modern. But in addition to their dependence, you have the countries of the former Soviet Union, all of whose armies were trained, built by, and use all that weapons, all that technology. And the Middle East is a purchaser of all that weaponry too. There is a concern, I think, is legitimate, and not only on the part of the West, that Russia has become so involved in the arms sales business that it jeopardizes our interests, but a lot of Russians are themselves saying, why are we selling the rope to hang ourselves with by giving a country like China, with whom we could have, our strategic relations with China are great right now, but what happens 10, 15, 20 years down the line if those strategic relations change? So again, it's a good question that I can't really answer in great technical detail. Yeah.
Now you talked about Russia's on the resurgence, on the upside, on the upswing, but they have a lot of negative demographic trends, like the population's declining, and there's no rule of law. They have a lot of unstable factors. Is that going to derail them anytime soon, or can their economic growth keep up with that?
No, you're right to pinpoint that some of the negative tendencies. You mentioned two. One of them more on the political side, and the other on the demographic side. Let me take those separately a little bit. Clearly, the demographic issue is a danger. The average age for the Russian male today is around 50. I mean, it's really low. And the Russian population is declining, and fairly severely. And part of that is due to drug usage, it's due to AIDS, but above all, it's due to alcohol abuse, especially for males. And it really is a serious concern. On a really microcosmic level, because I've done a lot of my research in regional Russia, and particularly in the city of Yaroslavl, where I spent some time a few weeks ago. And I talked with the people were developing a long-range plan, and the bottom line of that plan is that the population of this large, important industrial, cultural, historic regional capital is that the population is declining so severely. And so what are they going to do? Much of their long-range planning is built about how do we encourage young people to have children. Well, that means you've got to have infrastructure, you've got to have transportation, you've got to have decent housing, and all the other things that are planned around that. So there's a sense of urgency in dealing with the demographic problem, because if they don't, you're right, in the long run it'll undermine their abilities in other areas. On the political side, the larger question that you're right to raise, particularly the question of a rule of law and the seeming inability of Russians to institutionalize a rule of law. In many ways, Russia remains a political, depend on the rule of law, but on the rule of men, of individuals, and things are done on the basis of what the Russians call poznakomstvo, on the basis of who you know, on the basis of svazi connections, and what the laws and the institutions really don't matter. It's if you want to get things done, you got to go to the right person. There's that unfortunate tradition, and it seems to continue to some extent. So rule of law is weak, but changing, I think. The other institutions that, the reality is Russia is a much less, in my view at least, Russia is a much less free place today in 2007 than it was when Putin came to power in 1999. There are no kind of independent institutions that can act to constrain the use, maybe abuse, of executive authority. There's no longer a party system that is competitive and can contest the president and the president's party, United Russia. The legislature is compliant. His deputies and people who support him are overwhelmingly in place there. He's undermined the independence of the media, so that particularly television. There really is no independent voice on television. In the print media there is, but not in television. He's undermined the oligarchs, who were independent sources of political wealth, particularly a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was put under arrest because he was able and considering using his enormous wealth to fund political organizations which were in opposition to Putin leadership. Arrested, put into jail, and taken all his billions of dollars away. It was a nasty business. I could go on, but all of the independent possible institutions, courts, that could exercise constraint on executive authority in Russia have been steadily eroded over the past 7 years. With that said, Vladimir Putin is an incredibly popular politician. He consistently has approval ratings well over 70%. And it's not hard to understand why. If you ask a Russian, are you better off now or when you were under Yeltsin 7 years ago, when things were more quote-unquote democratic, most Russians would overwhelmingly say, I'm much better off. I live better, I live more securely, life is not chaotic. Who needs democracy if democracy means that criminals go free, that there's no transparency of economic transactions, From the Russian point of view, they're a lot better off, most of them. And so you've got to ask yourself, in a democracy at some point, doesn't the fact that the people, that the consent of the governed is important somewhere. So, you're right to mention all those problems. And yes, they do need to be resolved if Russia's going to move ahead. But as far as I think these issues are concerned, Russia's ability to pursue its own interests, some of which will coincide with ours and some of which won't, that's going to continue. Anyone else? Before we go to cookies. Never get between an audience and their cookies. Andrew.
Just regarding Putin's successor, how likely is he to, well, continue Putin's sort of depiction of the Russian 20th century?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and an interesting question, and the likely answer is yeah. The next person, whoever it is going to more or less be a Putin clone, I think, at least in the short run. That's part of the answer. There are three leading candidates, are Medvedev and Sergei Ivanov, former defense minister. Both of them are now deputy prime ministers, first deputy prime ministers. And then, again, while I was in Russia, the prime minister, Fradkov, was replaced by a new prime minister named Zubkov, who was a close ally of Putin's from his St. Petersburg days. And Zubkov is a tough, smart administrator, but he's not a politician. He's not got a high political profile in Russia. It seemed that he was chosen to that. On the contrary, he was probably chosen because he's a good manager and not a high profile politically. So the speculation is running that it'll be one of these three people. Whichever it is, if it is among those three, I don't expect any radical departures from Putin's policy. It'll be Putin without Putin. What's more interesting was the other thing that happened while I was over there, and that is that Putin accepted the nomination of his political party, United Russia, to head its party list. The parliamentary elections, as a few of you may know, this year in December, will for the first time be all deputies will be elected by running on a party list. There will be no longer single-member district seats available. This, on one hand, enhances the role of political parties in Russia, and in theory, institutionally creates grounds for creation of a multi-party system. The reality of it, at least in the short run, is that United Russia is going to get more than a vast majority of the seats in the parliament. So things are not going to change from that point of view. However, during his announcement that he would run as the leader of the party list, it's not quite like Britain. To become leader of the party list doesn't automatically make you prime minister. The prime minister of Russia, at least the Constitution is now written, Prime Minister of Russia is appointed by and can be removed by the President of Russia at any time. And that person doesn't come from Parliament necessarily. So Putin has said, I'll lead the party, but I'm not going to become a member of the party. And if I get elected as leader on this list, I'm not going to hold a seat in Parliament. What that suggests to me is that he has his eyes on becoming, but he said, I would consider becoming prime minister. And I think that you may see it as a movement in the direction of somewhat more similar to a European parliamentary democratic system, in which Parliament plays a bigger role in governing than the current highly super presidential system that is the Russian system today. For that to happen, and for Putin to have real power as either leader in Parliament, if that's what he chooses, or as prime minister, it seems to me you're going to have some constitutional changes made. Not so that he can run again as president, at least not this year, but whereby the prime minister can't be removed. If he's prime minister, he doesn't want to be removed by a president with whom he suddenly disagrees. And he doesn't want Parliament to be dissolved, which it can be. If the Parliament disagrees, as you know, 3 times with the President over its nomination for a Prime Minister, the President can dissolve Parliament. That's also not a position that I think that Putin wants to be in. So I would anticipate that after the parliamentary, and probably after the presidential elections, something's been worked out with either Zubkov, very probably, or maybe Ivanov, to make some changes in the structure of the Russian political system. It should be interesting to watch. Anyone else? Cookies, anyone? Yes, please.
What's your solution, your personal solution for this disparity between the United States and Russia? I mean, you presented all these problems.
Right.
What's your personal solution?
I really think, and I guess let me really make it clear, I may have been gentler in my presentation than I meant to be. I really think that it's the Bush Doctrine. That's the problem. If you're a Russian or French or German or almost anything else, Chinese, and you have an American president who insists on doing what he wants to do, where he wants to do it, when he wants to do it, how he wants to like it or not, whether it's in your interests or not, you're going to create an antagonistic environment in which to act. And I think a lot of the difficulties come from that unwillingness to negotiate, to enter into agreements, alliances, diplomacy with other countries who, and to take into consideration the interests of those other countries. And so again, whether you're Republican or Democrat, that solution still seems to me to be the way to go. What we've been doing for the past 7 years has eroded, I think, the possibilities for cooperation with Russia that would have been to our advantage as well as to theirs. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, good. Thank you so much for coming. A lot of you came out tonight. I'm very grateful. I'm honored, and thanks